right, our next talk. Dr. Haber recently completed his scientific doctorate in the Department of Global Health and Population Science at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill with expertise in statistical causal inference methodology, scientific and statistical translation, and economics. We're excited to have him here today to present about the influence of science, media, and society on decision-making and health outcomes.
Thanks. Hi there. So I have a dubious honor here today, on top of having just inserted a typo on my cover slide. My dubious honor is I am probably the person here who knows the least about TBIs and sports and most of the subjects we're talking about here today. But that also means that I am gifted with the ability to probably be the person that learns the most throughout the day. So thank you for having me. So what I want to do is I want to zoom way back, so way out, and I want to talk about how all of science interacts with this problem. And I'm going to do so through causality. I'm going to talk about politics and a bunch of other things. When we look at the science behind TBIs and behind sports, the question that we usually ask is, what do scientific studies say about TBIs in sports? And I've stolen two quotes here today, and I want to juxtapose them together, and I'm being a little bit unfair. So earlier today, you might have seen me furiously taking quotes. These are my two favorite. Dr. Small earlier today said, the science is meager. This is a little bit exaggerated, a little bit embellished, but this was making a very good point. That this,
my NIH grant now.
Yeah.
All the reviewers are going to see this.
Sure. And then Dr. Bao later on said, what do we know? A lot. And what I wanted to go over is how both of those are true in really important ways, and ways that we need to understand and need to be able to express. Right? It's very, very complicated. But to do that, we need to go over a lot of things. We need to start with expanding the question. So it's not just about what does science know here, it's also about how does science know things, what can and can't science know about this, what should and shouldn't we do and say and think and study, what about consensus versus science and scientists, what do we think, how do we advise, we're talking about sports and TBIs, cognitive health, human lives. This is a huge question, right? We can't just be thinking about what does science say about TBIs. We need to think about all of these things. And one in particular that I really want to focus on is the should and shouldn't, which we'll get to at the end. This is a very, very complicated question. And as well as those parentheses, the can and can't as well. Can't is important. And to do that, we need to talk about a lot of things. We need to talk about causality and science and statistics and scientific institutions and media and social media and people and, unfortunately, the P word, politics. It does get involved here in a very important way. So I want to start with causal inference. So as mentioned, I am an econometrician, so that's one of the two fields in statistics that deal a lot with this idea of causality. The other one is epidemiology, and I'm also involved in that as well. And it's everything is based in causality. Everything we sort of think about here is based in causality and causal inference. And so when we talk about a determinant of disease, it's something that brings about a change. When we talk about policy, what we're saying is we want to change policy or change something, and what is the changed result as a result, right? Everything we do, we think about it in terms of causality. So if you see something that says a new study finds that red wine is linked to Alzheimer's disease, what you really want to know is not, do people who drink red wine have more or less Alzheimer's disease? It's, should I drink more red wine or less red wine? And what is the result in my likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease later? We've all heard correlation does not imply causation, but correlation can often imply causation to those who are not actively thinking about it or have not had the privilege of having a lot of education about that. And specifically for TBIs, we're thinking about what is the effect or the impact. Those are causal words. Those at their base mean cause of sports and TBIs on brain injuries and health and all of these things. And that's a really hard question. So correlation is fairly easy, relatively easy. Causality is hard. And I'm not going to go into how to do a good causal study or anything like that. That's incredibly difficult. But I do want to think about how things get there. And I also want to expand and talk about how research gets from the generation phase all the way down to health decision impact. It's a very, very complicated process. It takes a long time. We start from research generation from folks like myself who write papers, then eventually, hopefully, they get published and then disseminated throughout social media and so on, then consumed by people, and then finally a health decision impact. But everywhere along the way, things go wrong. And more importantly, the ways that things go wrong, and sometimes right as well, feed back. It's a really, really complicated thing. So for example, I don't bother doing research unless it's going to get published. Publishers are maybe less likely to publish something unless it's going to get news. News is going to be less likely to be written unless it gets clicks on social media, which is a form of consumption. And then at the end there, we have the health decision impact based on that whole story. So it's a very real problem. These feedback loops are very important. And we see them all over the place. We see them in academic research. We see them in media organizations, so publication bias, p-hacking. Career incentives are really important, cultural norms. There's all sorts of, the problems in media I think are a little bit more transparent, right? Everything is based on clicks, their spin, and so on. And research consumers have basically the same sets of issues as well, including weak understanding of strength of evidence. By the way, this is not just from everyday folks. This is also on the clinical side as well. So most doctors don't have a super rigorous statistical causal inference training. Very few people do in general. And so we also have issues with statistical understanding from even medical doctors and clinicians of that sort. So nobody's immune to this. I'm not immune to this. It is a pervasive problem pretty much everywhere. And of course, everything is changing, right? We have all social media, and we now have fake news, which I hate to say. And I hate the phrase fake news. We have everything is on, we receive a lot of our news through social media. So 62% of Americans say that they received their news from social media in 2016. That number is certainly a low estimate. I bet it's much, much, much higher. And one of the reasons for that is that social media drives traditional media. What pops up on your favorite news media site first on the top headlines, that's driven by what's on Twitter. Right? So there's a feedback loop that's often hidden behind here. And there's also questions about whether or not this information is reliable. One really important thing is that the internet media acts as a sort of catalyst, right, for some of these bad incentives and a mechanism for bypassing some of the sort of gatekeeping mechanisms that have previously been there. So it's really sort of a catalyst for some of the best, but also a lot of the worst things. This will all become important in just a second. And weak causal inference matters, right? So by the time somebody gets information, they have to make a decision. And if they're getting bad information, they make bad decisions. There are quite a few examples of this. I will get into potentially some in a little bit. But more importantly, I think the indirect effects are even more important. So if people are getting bad information, that space could have in theory been used for better information. So there's sort of a crowding out effect. And the one I'm really going to talk about is credibility, and we'll get back to TBIs on that one. That is extremely important, right? So we all sort of know about this. We've heard about the replication crisis and all of that kind of stuff, right? Everybody has been reading, right? So we're gonna spend a lot of time there. And a few anecdotes about how this is happening. So articles from higher impact journals that are more discussed are more likely to be retracted. Half of articles making the news are overturned in meta-analyses later, right? These are probably sort of some of the same reason things that are receiving more attention are more scrutinized, so they're more likely to get retracted. There's one that I really love. In 2015, there were 36 meta-analyses about coffee. There is no plausible way that 36 meta-analyses could be written if we didn't have these sort of feedback loops. By the way, I looked recently, and that number has gone down to 8 this year, which I find really interesting. I don't know what happened in 2016. Who knows? And then what I'll spend a lot more time on, both the studies and media articles about some X versus some health Y in social media are likely to be weak and misleading, and I'm going to go into this in quite a bit of detail. So we did the study we call the claim study. What we did is we looked at this problem. We wanted to see what happens at the end of that pathway, at the point at which people are receiving things in social media. So we're not looking at all of media. We're not looking at all of academia. We just want to know what the state of the world is on Facebook and Twitter basically, right? So what we did is we partnered with an organization called NewsWhip, and we pulled the top 64 most shared media articles about the top 50 most shared academic articles of the form study is on X versus some health Y in human subjects, right? Exposure versus outcome had to be a health outcome, right? So we're not looking at all of health literature. We're just looking at this specific format of study and media article about it. And so we reviewed them in depth. We reviewed them for causality. So the first thing we had to do was we had to get a lot of reviewers, and we were very fortunate to have a huge set of awesome reviewers from 6 universities. We had 21 people, mostly late-stage doctoral students, all causal inference folks in various stages of education and so on. And we did a really intense review process, so this should sound familiar for those of you who have done systematic review. We had 2 independent reviews and 1 arbitrator. And then we randomly assigned everybody to a set of articles, and people could recuse themselves and so on. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail here about pretty much any of this review process, but the tool is really important. Reviewing causality is extremely hard, so this is not something that peer review typically does. There does not exist a really good review tool for doing this. We think we've made some headway here. There are some other efforts that have made some good headway as well since the time at which we did this. But we reviewed a lot of things about each of these studies. We reviewed the strength of causal inference and things like statistical methods, covariates, the ways that they measured their covariates, generalizability. So we had both internal and external validity. The language the academic authors used, the media articles about them, the language and the accuracy in there. And we used a scale at the end that was based on decisions. So at the very high end, evidence is fully applicable in health policy and practice, down to the low. So high and very high should be considered conclusive. And we looked at language as well. So weak to strong is basically by ambiguity, right? And so what did we find at the end? Well, I wouldn't be up here if everything was great. So what we found is basically what you'd expect. Among the studies most likely to be shared on social media, only 6% of them had high strength of causal inference, or high or very high strength. So that's our conclusive side. But when we go to how the authors described them, about 20% of them used unambiguously strong causal language, right? So we have some overstatement. And by the time we get to the media articles, that gets even bigger, right? So put it in another way, if we want to think about this a little bit better, if we had the strength of causal inference according to our reviewers, by the way, these are subjective measurements. There's no objective way to do this. So this is what our reviewers thought. It was a very guided process, but it's still ultimately subjective. So if we look at the x-axis here, is from very low to very high strength of causal inference, and then on the y-axis, the strength of language. What we'd ideally like is for them to be mostly causal, mostly stronger studies, and to be described accurately. So at least be along the diagonal, preferably up at this top right corner, right? And maybe. What we see is mostly weak studies, as described before, but mostly described in this weak, ambiguous language. This is a result of academic culture, right? If you have a study that is not causal, you can say association only, and that's considered fine. That's actually probably a really big problem in academia, and we can talk about that a little bit later. When we look at the media translation, so we want to be along the diagonal. We don't really want to be in the overstatement zone. We might be okay with things being too conservative. We start to see problems, right? We don't want to be up in that zone. And then when we put it all together, if we look at the strength of causal inference, versus what people are getting, so what you see versus what you get, we are definitely in the worst possible zone, right? Things are bad. Now, we did the top 50 media articles, and one of them, it just so happened to be this article. So there are 50 articles. By the way, it is worth mentioning at least one of the authors of this study spoke this morning. It was a great talk. So there's that. Age at first exposure to football is associated with altered corpus callosum white matter and microstructure in former professional football players. I have no idea what that middle line means, but it is important. I've been told.
The right and left brains are connected to each other.
Got it. Okay, cool. See, I learned something today. I made I connected a synapse at least. So this was one of the papers that was most popularly shared in 2015. And it was rated, and it was not rated well. So this was our quote from our final reviewer. So this was given a low strength of causal inference rating, inappropriate control of confounders, both by including variables that are potentially on the causal pathway. That, by the way, is a giant issue, so that's not a small one. And not considering causes of the exposure, very small sample, and cross-sectional study design and potential misclassification of exposure, not generalizable to non-professional youth athletes, other sports, or females. So this is, these are some pretty serious errors in this one particular study. Interestingly, there was some disagreement between the reviewers about a few things. It was relatively minor, but it is worth noting that even very, very skilled people with very, very guided processes can disagree about some of this. So take that with a grain of salt. However, it was used relatively weak language, only weak or moderate, so it mostly said X is associated with Y, not caused. But it was really about causality, probably. When we go to the media article that was associated with this, we see sort of a partial accuracy that the media article focused on topics that were not really in the what the study was about. They were, there were sort of all sorts of issues and much too strong causal language, right? This is sort of typical of what we would see in our sort of sample. Now, normally, I don't like to pick on studies like individually, right? I normally present the results in aggregate because, it's much better. It's also, well, I don't want to just keep my job. It's also everybody. I have papers like this too, right? This is not limited to one particular person. It's not their fault necessarily, and there's large and complicated reasons why things end up this way. That is not any individual sets of authors' results. But this did just happen to be one of the ones that we picked up, and it was worth discussing. And it's extra worth discussing because I did a PubMed search last week to look at TBIs, and I just searched, in quotes, traumatic brain injury. Not any synonyms, not anything like that, just traumatic brain injury. And there were 31,500 hits, which is insane, right? That is a lot of literature. Half of those were from the past 5 years. 276 of those are meta-analyses themselves, so there's enough literature that there are 276 meta-analyses. And the one that we just happen to pick up, the only one that most people saw in 2015, the one study is 0.003% of all the literature, but that was everything that people saw in 2015, right? That's a huge problem. And the one that they picked up is not very strong, right? They didn't pick up much consensus. They didn't pick up much of this, a lot of the other things that we might be interested in. Now, causality is really hard. We can't do randomized controlled trials for TBIs because that would basically look like getting a bunch of 12-year-olds in a room and then throwing balls at them until some of them had concussions randomly, and that's terrible and not practical and unethical. So that's really bad. So we have to we're already at sort of a, maybe this might be a second best sort of study situation. Now, there are other kinds of trials in this. I'm not saying that's the only kind of trial, and they do exist. But when you look at, so I did a quick search of all of this literature, and I picked up most of the popular studies. This is, by the way, just my opinion from browsing through here. This is not a systematic review or anything like that. So take that with a grain of salt as well. But I tended to find that there were a lot of strong TBI studies, right? There were things there was a lot of good evidence about, and most of the ones that I found to be the strongest were relatively short term. They were relatively specific, using medically testable outcomes that had good theoretical reason to be specific to an injury or some sort of trauma. So some of the brain scans that had good theoretical grounds to say this can only have been from impact, or at least is extremely unlikely to be from something else, and they had easily measurable exposures. These things don't come together very often, but there does exist good evidence that looks like this that shows causality.
Did you look at animal studies and human studies?
So I only looked at human studies, but I'll get to the animal studies in just a second. And then there was a lot of weak studies. So most studies in any disease area are probably going to be weak. This is no exception here. So they tended to be the things that had long-term complex outcomes, complex exposures, things like depression that has, is related to basically everything, right? Those are hard things to separate and to isolate. especially over the long term, especially when the outcomes are also complicated, or the exposures are also complicated. So participation in sports is a complicated thing that has to do with, again, everything, right? It has to do with wealth, and it has to do with personality and behaviors and so on. These are really hard things to separate. And of course, measurement error, especially from recall and those kinds of things. And the weaker studies also have this really, this special property, they're more likely to conflict. That is really important because conflict is one of the things that we have to sort of deal with. So we have a mixed strength of causal inference. Most studies, as expected, are individually weak. Some are collectively strong. Some are individually strong. It's worth noting that not all studies contribute towards being collectively more strong. It actually is a relatively rare situation to be able to combine studies in a useful way. And actually, in a lot of things that make studies generally weak also make them not very useful to combine in meta-analyses. Don't need to go into too much detail, but that tends to be true. And of course, this fuels public distrust in science, right? So many of the major problems we have are from these flip-flopping results, right? So there was a Lewis Black joke from like 1999 about how he doesn't use sunscreen because the same people who told him to use sunscreen are the people who told him that eggs were good for you and then they're bad for you and then only the outside is good for you and then you should not eat the inside, and then he doesn't use sunscreen anymore. And we've seen this for decades. It's probably much more severe now that people are getting their information much more instantly. People know that they're sort of getting disproportionately, or at least they know they're getting weak evidence. Maybe they don't know they're getting disproportionately weak evidence, which is something interesting. And then there's inherent scientific uncertainty. So we always say, science is uncertain. It's about uncertainty. Statistics is the field of uncertainty, right? But what uncertainty means to us is not necessarily the same thing that it means to everybody else, and that adds to a lot of confusion, and I'll talk about that. And then there's also political and social preferences, which can never be extracted fully from this. Perceived and actual financial conflicts of interest. There is some degree to which finance impacts scientific decisions. In some cases, it's huge, such as when sports fund the studies. That's a serious conflict of interest potentially. Sometimes it's much more subtle. So how do I keep my career up as an academic? And then, of course, there's a lack of scientific and statistical literacy that makes it easy for sort of some of these misconceptions to happen. And all of this together feeds into the grand credibility crisis, right? And it's not just a sort of a perceived crisis. It is an actual crisis in a lot of sense. Crisis may not be the best word. It's maybe more fixable than a lot of people realize, and we don't actually know the extent to which it is a crisis. That is typically what the words that most people use. I don't usually agree with that. And we have to know where people are getting this information. So most people are getting their information from general news sources. General news sources don't tend to be the best rated. So Pew has some really nice research on where people are getting their science education. Most people are getting them from news outlets that cover a range of topics, but a minority of people say that they actually get the facts right. The general news sources get the facts right. The numbers are a little higher for specialty sources, but they're not that much higher. And there's all kinds of fun stuff in here. So people strangely believe that the news does a good job of covering science, but also think that the biggest problems in science are the way that reporters cover it. So there's a little bit, there's some back and forth here. That's not inherently incompatible, but it's, there's a bit of conflict in what people believe or at least report on these sorts of surveys.
Public trusted polls.
Yes, public trusted polls. Pew tends to do a really good job with polls, by the way. And of course, this is political. It always will be political, and I have to put this up here because that is the reality. This is not the same across political ideologies and beliefs, and we'll talk what some of those operating political ideologies and beliefs are in TBIs. But when we're looking at things like the media does a good job of covering science, people who lean Dem tend to have a slightly higher rate of saying that they do a good job than people who lean Republican. When we're talking about pretty much across the board, news media are too quick to report research findings that don't hold up. Republicans tend to be slightly higher. So this is a divide across political parties and political ideologies as well. And it is worth considering, and it is doubly worth considering because, we have a sort of perceived, mistrust in science in the political realm as well. So I was among those who helped organize the March for Science in 2016. I am very strongly on the side that science is political, but that is a much larger topic that we could get into. So here's a fairly typical tweet about TBIs, right? So this is from BBC, which is typically considered a fairly reliable news source, that said, a new study has linked concussion to mental health problems in ex-sportsmen. I have not clicked on this. I don't actually know what the article says, and I don't actually know what the academic article to which this is referring says, but this is, to most people, more or less indistinguishable from this. 3 cups of coffee a day may have health benefits, right? This is the same sort of thing, right? If all of this is roughly equal in credibility, we have a huge problem, right? I don't know, I can almost guarantee, because I know a lot of things about coffee studies, this is probably not a great study. I spend a lot of my time on coffee studies. But, by the time this gets down to the consumer, these look the same. And if these look the same and people distrust things like this, it shouldn't be a big surprise that people are distrusting pretty much everything else, and that's really important. Now, so we're in a situation in which we do have strong evidence in TBIs, and actually it's mostly because of the specificity issue that I talked about. It's not obvious, it's limited, so we're not talking, a lot of it's not the best in the long-term issues. They're weak and conflicting studies all around, right? That are also indistinguishable. We're talking about the things we care about are these longer-term, harder to measure issues, so depression and mental health issues and so on, and things that follow you throughout your life. Those are much harder to measure. And then we have really strong political and social preferences. And some of the ones that are in operation here are things like, my freedom to choose, right? Why do you guys hate sports? Those kinds of things. Those are really politically strong messages in a lot of areas of politics and social preferences and so on. And those are things that we have to keep in mind as we're doing this kind of science and translating it. And then, of course, big companies, a lot of money funding a lot of the studies that at least gives a perceived conflict of interest and adds to some of the distrust in academic research. And then we have actually manufactured doubt. And if you are watching all of these things and you are paying close attention, this should all sound familiar, because I'm not actually talking about TBIs. I'm talking about smoking and lung cancer. We've seen all of this before, right? This is not the first time that these sorts of things have all come together. Now, I'm slightly hopeful because things turned out fairly well in the smoking and lung cancer situation, right? Although it's ongoing as always. But this is an excellent place to look for examples of how we actually move forward on this. But it took decades. It took forever for these things to move, right? And we're in a very different situation now than in the 60s. This is also, by the way, not the first time smoking and lung cancer has come up today, but the analogy works much deeper, perhaps, than had previously been discussed. So, what can we do as scientists? Well, so on the production side, we need stronger causal evidence when we can get it, right? Causal evidence is really hard, and we can't always get it. And we need less weak causal evidence when we can't, right? We should not be putting so much stuff out there that is weak, that is easy to be mistranslated, and easy to be overturned by the next weak study, because weak studies can conflict a lot, and they add to sort of this uncertainty. And also, we should be doing much more clearly non-causal evidence. So Dr. Bao earlier today had presented some associational evidence that was clearly not causal, and it was great, right? It talked about the association between reporting and various social aspects. It was not necessarily, the exposures in this case were talking about a larger culture. It was not necessarily talking about the cause of those things and reporting, right? That was really nice. It was a good way to use association in a not causal way that has policy impact, right? So Dr. Bao came back, I promise. And then we need to think and act well beyond the publication. So we need to communicate consensus, right? So we have those 31,000 studies. How do we put them all into into statements that are easy for people to use, and then how do we get that out into the media so that people are talking about these things rather than new study says, right? We need to communicate knowledge. So it's not, we as scientists don't just make studies, we know stuff. We should communicate what we know, right? What we actually have learned through this. So in the case of the animal studies in mice, we do actually have a fair good of theoretical evidence from things like mice and so on that we can use. That we have, we have reason to believe that there are these certain types of brain effects and so on. We may not have a study that shows it, but we have pretty good theory, and that's something that we can say that we know even in the absence of a provable, excellent, perfect study. And we should express that as our expert opinions and use the theoretical knowledge. We also need to get really good at acting in the absence of evidence. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We need to make sure that we express that the uncertainty doesn't mean that we don't know stuff. Sometimes statistical and scientific uncertainty is different than general colloquial uncertainty. And we also need to be ready to step aside. So we as scientists can take up a lot of space when there are a lot of other people who can more effectively communicate something. So often we think of science, everything should be science, but it's not always the most effective strategy, right? Sometimes we need to say, let's let somebody else who can talk about their personal story or something like that along those lines take the stage. And there's our March for Science crowd. That's it. Thanks. Oh, questions? This is very much a discussion. A lot of this is my opinion, so feel free to disagree and or ask questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can bring you the mic. Otherwise, we will move to the next speaker. Oh, wait.
She's on the track. So a lot. I mean, some of the problems you mentioned are just inherent in our system of, say, promotion and tenure, for example. Yeah. I put it on us that we don't promote people in academic institutions unless they have a certain number of, ounces or pounds or kilograms of papers published, and that doesn't really necessarily relate to any of the validity of those results, right? I'm in the process of starting a new academic journal. And I'm interested to know, I've actually contacted a few people who are interested in statistical procedures for imaging and for EEG and other kinds of things. And nobody has time to review all these papers when they come in. So what are the practical solutions to these issues that are just endemic in the way we do our work?
So that's an incredibly complicated question. I have spent literally hours talking about that in the past, so I don't want to take up too much time. There are a lot of people working on some things that are relatively revolutionary and so on about improving the peer review process. So one of what I hope to make one of my lifetime projects is sort of a way to enhance and augment the peer review process and make it much faster. Right. So the kind of review we did took 5 to 6 hours per reviewer per study. So 3 reviewers per study to do what we did. That's an insane amount of time, and we're just looking at causality, right? So this is really hard, and the promotion process makes it even more difficult because nobody has time for that, and there's no sort of incentive for people to do that, and also lots of cultural concerns. So the short version is it's an unbelievably complex problem, but there is some hope, and that there are things coming down the pipeline that will help alleviate that particular issue, and I'll maybe take that one offline.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, do we have any other questions?
No, but a comment to suggest a solution.
Yeah.
The 5 large publishing corporations in the world are the most profitable corporations, return on investment, higher than Microsoft, higher than Apple, okay? Because somebody else pays for the product, somebody else writes the product, peer reviewers don't get paid to review the product, and the editors are paid a pittance. Okay? That doesn't have to be that way. For example, the Ivy League schools and Stanford got together and said, we're going to create our own journals, right? And we're going to encourage our faculty to publish in our journals. Okay, then you would have plenty of money to, by the way, at Brown they cut back. Brown was a relatively wealthy institution.
They've been cutting back on the number of journals they've been subscribing to because this cost is so outrageous. So it's a non-trivial problem that affects all of this and all of academia, and there's a solution, okay? Because all of these people could get together as nonprofits, create, it's not hard. So I run a journal too. The software is available, there's free software, there's cheap, inexpensive software, either one. And you can take it over and take it away from Rupert Murdoch and company, okay? There's no reason for them to be making these kind of profits. And by the way, there's a bigger adverse side effect. In developing countries, they don't get any access to this because they can't afford to get it.
So a lot of what you're talking about is, turned off. Oh, that's there. That's wrapped up in a lot of the open access debate as well. So I am a little bit more cautious about the approach to open access than many are, in part because if we just if we just do open access as is, we are increasing vastly the amount of information that people who don't have the ability to process that information can choose from. I don't have the ability to process 31,000 studies. So if we just made all that open access, we haven't really improved the situation. We may actually make it harmful. These are really complex problems, and these sort of just change the journals things may actually have these sort of spiraling out of control secondary effects that we really need to be worrying about. But I don't want to take the stage.
I want to make David happy for a second. I just quit Elsevier after 15 years as an editor-in-chief, and I'm starting my open access journal. My open access journal is with MIT Press. Open access, open data, et cetera, et cetera. That looks like I think
As we've discussed at length today, sports-related concussion is not only an individual injury, it's a much wider public health issue with ethical implications. Our next speaker is a postdoctoral fellow at NYU-Langone Health, where she studies public health and sports safety. To discuss our moral obligation to address this problem from a public health perspective, we are proud to welcome Dr. Kathleen Bachynski.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all so much for having me. So as a public health person, I thought it would make sense to talk about this issue from a public health perspective. And that includes both public health science and epidemiology, which a lot of our expert speakers have already talked about today. So I'll try to run through that part quickly. And it also involves some ethical questions about what public health policies might look like in this area. So there's sort of four main issues that I'm hoping to touch on here. And the first is, what are the public health goals of sports in schools in the first place? I know that's a very big step kind of question, but I think it's important to actually step back and try to remind ourselves of what benefits can we actually get from sports being in schools? And second, and I'll run through this very quickly since we've already talked about it so much, what is the public health scope of brain injury in college sports in particular? Third, what are some policies or strategies to actually prevent brain trauma before it happens? And finally, what is the ethical responsibility to study and implement those policies and generally to protect athletes' health? So starting with the general public health goals, these are probably going to seem super obvious, but it's worth spelling them out. I think we can divide them into the two categories of maximize the benefits and minimize the harms. So whatever benefits we think are actually associated with sports, I think it's important to think about them both as mental and physical benefits, and it's important to think about making them accessible to everybody. And that means that a school sport program that emphasizes highly specialized, challenging sports for just a few of the most advanced athletes, sometimes with the goal of entertaining a community, is not actually the most beneficial focus from a public health point of view. Instead, it's important to make physical activity, social support, community, teamwork, any other benefits that are available through sports accessible to as many people as possible of all genders, all body types, all physical abilities, and so forth. The second goal is to minimize the harms of sport at the population level. And minimizing the harms from a public health point of view isn't just about managing injuries after they happen, though obviously that's very important. It's also about preventing them in the first place. And in order to prevent them in the first place, you need a comprehensive system for identifying them, for tracking them, and evaluating what the actual long-term consequences are. And on a similar note, we actually do need to assess the benefits in a much more rigorous way. So for example, there was a 2015 systematic review of different sports disciplines, this happened to be in adults, that sort of found that there's just actually not that much great long-term evidence assessing things like improved mental health, reduced morbidity, improved metabolic health, or other kinds of outcomes like that by specific sport. And that's important because, as I'm sure you can imagine, you know, what you're actually doing in swimming versus ice hockey versus water polo versus track versus all these other sports that we've discussed today is going to look very different. So these need to be evaluated in terms of their specific benefits and harms. And they also need to be evaluated from a population health level in terms of how many people are actually engaging in those sports. That'll identify how widespread the benefits and harms actually are. So that means I think that we need better assessment tools. One that actually came out this year that I find pretty promising, and I should note that this is in high school athletes now, so I don't know if anything like this has been done at the college level, is called the Healthy Sport Index. This was introduced by the Aspen Institute's Project Play. And as far as I know, and I'd love to hear if I'm missing any, but as far as I know, this is the first tool of its kind designed to actually try to assess the relative benefits and harms of the most popular high school sports. And as you can see, the index focuses on 3 different categories: physical activity, which is a good thing, you want to have physical activity; safety, that's also a good thing, you want to have safety; and psychosocial effects. Those can be good or bad. You want positive ones. So those are the 3 measures that they looked at. And I'm not going to go through all these details because it's really complicated, but just to give you one example, this is girls volleyball. This is their safety index for girls volleyball, and I just want to give you a sense of the different kinds of measures that they're incorporating into this index. So this includes overall injury rate, time lost to injury, rate of catastrophic injury, what % of injuries in girls volleyball actually required surgery, concussion rate, obviously of interest to us today. And so then they compile these different measures to get an overall safety index indicator. And they did this across 10 different sports, and they did these different indicators also for psychosocial and for physical activity. Yeah.
Was this original research, or was this based off Don Comstock?
I think Don Comstock and other researchers, they basically pulled whatever research they could find on these different measures, and I think Don Comstock's was included in that. Yeah. And so this I should say, is a newly proposed index. And so I'm sure there's going to be lots of room for critiquing and hopefully building on this. I'm hoping researchers who look at this might propose different factors or weighing them differently. This is just clearly a starting point. But I think it's a really useful one, at least as an idea of what kinds of frameworks might we use to get us thinking what benefits and harms, both short-term and long-term, might actually look like tailored to different sports. So of course, as you can see, they did pull out a separate measure for concussion rate, and that is obviously traumatic brain injury, the topic of the day. So now that I've given you this very broad overview of how we can think broadly about health, mental, physical, emotional in sports, I'm obviously now going to zero in a little bit more about brain injuries for the rest of the talk. So this topic obviously has been covered wonderfully earlier today, but on the topic of the public health scope of brain injury, I'm just going to highlight a couple quick points. We know that there is a huge burden of brain trauma in college sports. And this is just one study. As an example, this is a 2015 descriptive study that estimated that over 10,000 concussions take place annually among NCAA athletes in 25 sports. But I want to emphasize, along with other researchers who've emphasized this point, that this burden, 10,000 concussions a year would already be huge, but that's actually the bare minimum floor, and it's likely to be much, much higher, because again, these are depending on reporting and depending on who's actually seeking treatment, actually mentioning their symptoms. So the public health burden is likely to be much higher even than this for several reasons. Still, this issue of serious underreporting. Secondly, that these numbers generally do not, because they cannot, account for subconcussive trauma, which, as we've discussed today, refers to brain trauma which may not actually cause individual symptoms, but cumulatively has the potential to add up over time. Headers in soccer are a good example of one potential mechanism for subconcussive trauma, because often people aren't actually experiencing symptoms any individual time that they head the ball, but there are certainly imaging studies and other kinds of troubling studies, which Dr. Haber will probably point out. They are not like the highest level of causality, but they're really troubling. It's very troubling to see studies comparing soccer players' brains with those of swimmers and seeing different structural changes in the soccer players' brains, suggesting that even though they didn't experience symptoms, they may still have been experiencing brain trauma. And that kind of subconcussive brain trauma is not really getting reflected in this epidemiological literature. And then thirdly, because in public health, we do like to take what's called a life course approach, which means considering exposure to trauma over time or over a lifespan, which has also very importantly been mentioned earlier today. These studies focused on college-age injuries don't typically include those athletes' prior exposure to brain trauma before they got to college. So the public health effect of whatever brain injuries college athletes might experience are very likely to be building on whatever brain trauma they may have sustained earlier in their lives. So just to give a sense of this, and these are just numbers for tackle football, and these are estimates at the youth, high school, and college level. And obviously, as I'm sure you know, many more kids are playing football at the Pop Warner or high school level than that very small percent who ever make it to a college team. And for example, if somebody starts playing Pop Warner football at age 8, by the time that they're an 18-year-old first-year college football player, they've already been exposed to 10 years of repeated cumulative hits in a full-body collision sport before they ever put on that college football helmet. So from a public health perspective, brain trauma in college sports is a serious widespread risk, particularly in collision sports like football, that people might be playing for many years before they even get to college, that could potentially be adding up. And there is a growing body of evidence that shows that cumulative exposure to head impacts are associated with potential long-term consequences. So given that we want to maximize health benefits and accessibility to all in college sports, and to prevent as much as we possibly can the large-scale burden of brain trauma, particularly repetitive brain trauma, what kinds of strategies or policies do we need to think about? 3 of my main answers to that question are, first, being honest about the risks, this is the education component, and taking them seriously. Second, funding independent research. And third, actually reducing collisions, and in particular, head impacts. So starting with number 1, actually being honest about the risks and taking them seriously, we've had a lot more sophisticated discussion than what I'm going to provide earlier today about the exact nature of concussion education programs, which is really important. But I'm going to make an even more simple point. We're not even there to exactly designing the best possible education programs because we haven't even gotten a lot of coaches to even talk about this at all. I could have picked many examples to illustrate this, but I came across an article from the Collister College's student newspaper just yesterday that shows how much work we have yet to do. So this is a quote from yesterday, December 7th, quoting head football coach Tony Jennison, saying that he has not, to his knowledge, ever directly addressed brain injuries with his team or the potential long-term cost of playing football more broadly with them. In my view, this is simply unacceptable from a public health point of view. A public health approach to preventing brain trauma, at a bare minimum, has to include actually talking about this issue with students and their families. And although many colleges are clearly trying to improve their concussion education efforts, trying to implement standards, if head coaches and administrators are not leading the way on this topic, if they're not even discussing it, let alone providing comprehensive and accurate information, this sends a really bad public health message. It sends the message that neither the importance of recognizing brain injury symptoms in the short term, nor the importance of understanding the potential long-term consequences of cumulative brain trauma are necessary for athletes. It sends the message that the adults in charge of running sports teams do not see brain injury education as part of their job. And in fact, that very same newspaper article revealed the consequences of sending this kind of message. So this is a quote of a student football player on that team, and he says of his experiences talking about brain injury, it's mostly when we do talk about it out of humor. CTE, we say, yeah, that means committed to excellence. We make jokes about it. You can catch me saying, that's just my football brain, multiple times throughout the week. I think these two quotes that I've showed you are connected. The notion that CTE or football brains are a joking matter does not come from nowhere. And although it might be tempting to say, well, these students need to learn, I actually very much place a large amount of responsibility for this kind of attitude on the coaches, trainers, or other leaders who are involved in leading the sport. So what this means to me is that if schools or institutions are offering sports with known brain injury risks, they bear the responsibility of ensuring that those they hire to oversee those sports will actually talk about those risks honestly and seriously with any potential player. This might seem like a bare ethical, minimum prerequisite, but it's clearly not currently being met. And in order to meet this goal, schools need to not only establish clear standards for concussion education, which is obviously what's being done today at this conference, but they also need to ensure, they need to follow up and make sure that education is actually being provided, and they need to enforce meaningful consequences when those expectations are not met. By the way, if there are college students in this audience who are wondering what ways they might get involved to actually help on this issue, I do think that student reporting like this is actually really one fantastic thing that I've seen. So in this particular case, my hope is that the fact that the student journalist took the time to actually talk to the head football coach, talk to the football players, learn about what attitudes toward brain injury are actually there. I'm hoping this will shed valuable light on this issue. And I'm certainly hoping that the leaders at the school will read this and realize they need to take another look at what's going on and hopefully implement some changes. So that's my very simplistic point on education. The next thing I think needs to happen is robust funding of independent research on brain injuries in sports. Anybody who knows me knows that I love to pick on the NFL. They are still one of the biggest funders today of brain injury research. And unfortunately, the NFL has historically shown that its industry interests are not really fully compatible with public health objectives. In fact, only last year, the NFL's partnership with the National Institutes of Health, they donated $30 million to the NIH. That partnership fell apart after a US congressional investigation revealed that the league improperly tried to redirect some of that $30 million that it had donated to league-affiliated scientists that it sort of preferred to do the research, which was not an appropriate involvement of the league. While the NFL has been the clearest industry group with a major conflict in this area, this is also something worth thinking about, since we're in a college setting, about NCAA research. And I say that not to say that every industry-affiliated research is bad or wrong, but we do need to consider that any institution that makes enormous sums of money from sports programs may potentially have a conflict of interest here. And we need to be sure that we're thinking about that, particularly when it comes to brain trauma. And for that reason, I think it's crucial that academic research centers, hospitals, physicians, researchers, anyone else involved in this area need to make public trust and the integrity of their research their highest priorities. And the federal government needs to help out by robustly funding public agencies like the NIH to actually conduct independent brain injury research that shouldn't be depending on $30 million from the NFL to further our knowledge about brain injuries across sports. But as we've also heard today, just education and just research alone is not sufficient to change behavior or to actually reduce brain trauma. So ultimately, preventing injuries is going to involve making actual and sometimes fundamental changes to the ways that particular sports are played. So here are my three kind of possibly obvious, possibly bold, depending on how they're implemented, recommendations. First, in some sports, this might include eliminating the most risky mechanisms. And we've seen that kind of strategy in youth soccer, where they've eliminated or limited headers for younger kids. We've also discussed that kind of strategy in body checking, where the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no body checking up until age 15. So this is eliminating the sort of most collision-heavy or most risky mechanisms in some of these sports. Second, we've also discussed early today limiting things like full body tackling in football practices, which the Ivy League has done, which is a way of placing limits on exposure to the most risky mechanisms. And because, in particular, athletes spend so much time in practice, limiting their practice exposure to collisions has the potential to significantly reduce overall exposure. But it's also important to note that when it comes to the riskiest sports for the brain, and those are those full-body collision sports that involve repeated trauma inherently, these policies that might reduce some of those collisions or some of those really biggest hits might certainly help, but they are not going to fully get rid of this problem. In fact, as one of my colleagues, epidemiologist Zach Binney, likes to say, if you gave us a magic wand and said, by waving this, you could remove every single concussion from a sport like football, we would actually still be worried. I mean, that'd be great. We would want to reduce every concussion. But that actually wouldn't get rid of the potential repetitive brain trauma inherent in, for example, those 60 to 65 subconcussive blows that large linemen experience in every single game with those repeated collisions. So that does raise the question of the third and by far the most challenging strategy, which is deciding that maybe there are certain sports that pose such inherent risks to human brains that they might not be consistent with a public health mission to prioritize brain health. Of course, I fully recognize that most American schools, especially those with big-time football programs, are not going to suddenly eliminate their football programs, but I still think this is a serious public health option for consideration. And it is something schools, especially schools that might not have the greatest budgets, that might not have the ability to have athletic trainers and other support available at all times, should be thinking about. Again, from a public health point of view, do full-body collision sports truly offer maximal health benefits and minimize risks to the fullest extent possible of all the possible options for college sports activities? I think the answer to that question is no. So even if we might decide that it's unrealistic to get rid of certain collision sports, I would like us to at least acknowledge that the choice to offer collision sports might be showing that public health objectives are not always being prioritized. And on that note, I'd like to point out that colleges have actually gotten rid of collision sports before. Has anybody here heard of Charlie Moore? Anybody? Looks like no, so I'm excited to be able to tell this story. Charlie Moore was a boxer at the University of Wisconsin. At the time, boxing was one of the most popular college sports. It was an NCAA sport. And Wisconsin had won multiple national championships throughout the 1950s. In 1959, which was his junior year, Charlie Moore went undefeated. He won the NCAA championship in his 165-pound weight class. But according to Sports Illustrated, by the time Wisconsin prepared to host the NCAA championships in 1960, Moore was thinking of quitting boxing. His heart wasn't in it anymore. His memory was spotty. He had trouble deciding on the simplest things, when to eat lunch, when to study, when to work out. Today, we would certainly recognize those kinds of symptoms as signs of a potential brain injury. He was having trouble with memory and concentration. But at the time, Moore proceeded to step into the ring regardless. He felt a sense of obligation to box, both to his coaches and to the university, because they were giving him a scholarship for boxing. So tragically in this match, Moore got hit hard. He went down, he got back up, then he collapsed after leaving the ring. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage from the force of the blow, and after spending a week in a coma, he died on Easter Sunday, April 17, 1960. As Sports Illustrated explains, in the wake of Charlie Moore's death, a group of Wisconsin professors rallied, and just a couple weeks later, the faculty voted to drop boxing. Soon after, the NCAA announced that it would do the same. There are actually still some boxing clubs today at schools across the country, but there's no more boxing scholarships, and the NCAA hasn't ever officially sanctioned a boxing championship since Charlie Moore's death. So whether or not a similar trend ends up happening with tackle football or any other sport that's currently sanctioned, I do think this story is an important reminder that institutions of higher education and the NCAA are capable of making the decision to stop offering a sport if it causes death or serious health risks, and they've done this before. And that brings me to the final point that I want to make, which is that the NCAA, universities, coaches, and sports administrators all have an ethical responsibility here to think about how to most effectively intervene to prevent cumulative brain trauma in their students. And the NCAA has acknowledged this responsibility, which is where I got the title for this talk. They acknowledged that they had a clear moral obligation, and they did so in response to a 2011 football fatality from brain trauma. In particular, in this case, a Frostburg State football player in Maryland named Derek Shealy collapsed after preseason drills. He died from the brain trauma that he experienced. And specifically, he had experienced this brain trauma from performing a variation of what's known as Oklahoma drills. Is anyone familiar with those? So they're effectively these drills that require two players to run at each other at full speed, basically until one ends up winning and the other ends up on the ground. His death resulted in a lawsuit against the NCAA, in which lawyers for the NCAA wrote in a 2013 court filing that the NCAA, quote, denies that it has a legal duty to protect student athletes. The following year, in 2014, NCAA President Mark Emmert acknowledged in front of the US Senate that that had been a terrible choice of words made by the NCAA's legal team to try to make a legal argument. Instead, Emmert explained, we have a clear moral obligation to protect student athletes. Needless to say, I agree. The NCAA has a clear moral obligation to protect student athletes. And that moral obligation is not only about preventing deaths, although that is enormously important, both with more recent deaths like Derek Shealy's or Jordan McNair's, but also as they did with Charlie Moore's death nearly 80 years ago. I think the moral obligation here also extends to preventing repeated cumulative brain trauma that can have both serious short-term and long-term consequences on student health and well-being. So, to sum up, these are what I see some of these ethical responsibilities in this area from a public health perspective, if we're going to truly prioritize public health objectives. Maximize the health benefits that we can document from sports and minimize the harms. Honestly communicate the risks of the sports that schools choose to offer, and that needs to acknowledge both the life course exposure of those risks over an athlete's entire playing career, as well as what happens when they first step onto that college playing field for the first time. We need to weigh the risks and benefits of specific sports and ideally use a systematic framework to do so. That could be that healthy sport index discussed earlier, or maybe that'll be improved on. But whatever framework gets used, we need to identify how to weigh these different sorts of factors when we're making ethical judgment calls about what we're actually prioritizing. Fourth, I think there needs to be a greater willingness to make significant changes that are not just about managing injuries or other harms, but actually preventing them before they happen. And above all, I do think the top priority needs to be student welfare. That is a clear moral obligation of the NCAA and other sports leaders, and nowhere is this obligation more urgently needed than in addressing the public health problem of brain injuries in sports. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, if anyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is another great talk. I've heard you speak several times. I have a quick question about the relationship between clear moral obligation and duty of care.
Yeah.
And how you see them fitting together, and whether or not we can actually move forward using duty of care language.
Can you say just a little more about how you see duty of care language?
Well, one of my worries is that change will come through lawsuits. And I think that a duty of care sort of, at least as I understand it in occupational health, sort of is a structure one step before a lawsuit. I know this the most in silicosis. And I think by acknowledging who has a responsibility for what type of healthcare in the long term, or who has, I guess it's really responsibility. And is there a difference between the language of responsibility and obligation? Is it easier to work in a language of a legal framework versus a moral realm? I think that's sort of what I was wondering about, the two sort of fitting together.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in my ideal world, it would be the moral obligation that would be driving here. And I certainly think there's a number of institutions and coaches who are doing their very best to meet that moral obligation. But what I'm worried about is that that's just on the ground, not actually happening. I mean, we still have coaches who are not talking about brain trauma. And even beyond the realm of brain trauma, if I may use the example of the death of Jordan McNair, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the story, but earlier this year, a college football player died of heat stroke. Heat stroke is one of the easiest things to prevent. It's a completely preventable death. There's no need for athletes to die of heat stroke. So if there's prominent institutions that aren't capable of taking this obligation to protect student athletes to even just prevent heat stroke, which we have known techniques to prevent, I'm very concerned that preventing things like brain trauma, which is much trickier than preventing heat stroke. Certainly in a collision or contact sport, it's much harder to prevent something like brain trauma. I do think it's quite possible that it is on the ground actually going to be that legal framework that drives change. That's not the answer I want to give, but I'm worried that that's what might actually be the reality currently. I'd like to forestall that reality with talks like this, but I don't know if I can do it.
All right, thank you so much, Kathleen. All right, next up we have Braedan Russell. Braedan Russell is a senior at Brown studying business economics who has dealt with a number of concussions and lasting symptoms that prevented him from playing ice hockey in college after playing years of junior hockey in Canada. We are happy to have him here today to present on how to best support athletes with TBIs as well as the dangers of limiting mindsets.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. First, I want to say thank you to Emma and Kaylin for putting this whole day on today. And the stuff I'm going to cover is mostly just, I'm going to recount my events, my injury, and then on top of that, I guess a little bit about how I was dealt with in the process. And I know we have a lot of people here who are very involved in the space, and that's great. So hopefully, if anything else, I can be a reminder of who you're looking to help out. So a lot of the talks today were great for people like me, and hopefully there's less people like me moving forward because of a lot of the work that you guys are doing here. Sorry, I don't really need the slide anyways. So I'll start with my story. So I grew up in Canada, and in Canada, like the stereotype, it is true. We, as soon as we could walk, we could skate. I had a ice rink in my front yard by the time I was 4. So we had blades on our shoes. And I had a really healthy relationship with the game, and a really healthy relationship with hockey, and really enjoyed growing up, learning things like teamwork. Oh, well, I look better there. Maybe look at that. Yeah, so I grew up, learning these skills, say teamwork, hard work, a lot of things, and I kind of built who I was throughout the sport. Like I said, had a really healthy relationship with the game. It wasn't until I was about, say, 13, 14 that I started running into these injuries, these traumatic brain injuries. I had a really bad hit when I was, 14, and I really wanted to play on this Canadian national team, and because of that, that was where the the persistence of, even though I was hurt, I was going to go to these tryouts, I was going to play for this team, because I didn't have the knowledge of what was possibly going to happen to me if I came back and got a second hit during that window, or what the damage really going on was. So I was able to come back and play for that team and do those tryouts, and everything ended up being fine in that scenario. And then fast forward a couple years later is when I really started falling back into these injuries and dealing with post-concussion syndrome. Eventually, before I came to Brown, I had 2 really bad traumatic brain injuries. And then on my 3rd hit, that was when everything was kind of, everything in my life has kind of been a before and after. And I remember I took this hit and the rim at the time just started spinning. And I guess I tried to get it to stop, and I couldn't then, and I don't really feel like I ever have. And I woke up the next day and I had burning pain out of my eyes. I had long headaches. From the moment I woke up in the morning, I would wake up, I couldn't look at my phone. I couldn't stare someone in the eyes. I had light sensitivity. I had nausea. I had a whole lot of symptoms that I was now going to have to deal with, and that was the reality of my scenario. And I started with this coming into Brown about 3-4 months before. And the other side of things that we're talking about today is dealing with someone through post-concussion syndrome. So the way I was dealt with was I was already alone with this. I was scared. I didn't know what was going on. I had only heard that concussions, and that had been my experience, was a headache, or it was a couple months, or it was a couple weeks and you're fine. But this new laundry list of symptoms, everything felt different. Everything felt like it wasn't just gonna snap my fingers and I was gonna be back. So I got a call from my assistant coach at the time, and I thought I was gonna have to tell him that I was leaving sport, I was leaving hockey, and this was gonna be the hardest thing that I really ever had to do. And I was shocked at the time that wasn't the case. It wasn't gonna be me just saying, this is everything, this is the laundry list of what I'm dealing with. It was his response, and the response at the time was, do you even want to play hockey? Do you, I had concussions, Sidney Crosby had concussions, everyone's had concussions. You just need to change your mindset and get back in the game. You need to come back to the rink. You need to, basically the overlying sentiment was that I was just being weak, and that I was giving up on the sport, the team, and all the players around me. And I mean, I was already at a place where I didn't know what the future held for me, and now I was going to have to go one-on-one with where I thought my sport was, and it wasn't going to be there. So I was headed into Brown, and I was lucky enough, and this is the contrast. I had my head coach at the time call me and say, hey, if you come to Brown and you never play a game, that's completely fine. Just come, be part of the team, be part of the system. And that was a major difference for me. I had spent the couple weeks before that dealing on and off with a coach that didn't believe that I was being truthful, didn't believe that I was being honest, and at the time I was actively trying to break my legs so that I could hand over something when I showed up to Brown and say, hey, this is why, this is what's happening. I can't play because of my legs. I could hand over something that wasn't invisible. And that was the reality. So those are the differences. And when I showed up to school, unfortunately, this kind of harassment, this kind of disbelief continued. And back and forth between waking up in the morning and my eyes not being able to adjust to a screen. I didn't have the normal freshman, oh, who am I going to sit with at the lunch table? I couldn't go to most classes because I couldn't be near lights. I couldn't look down at my notes, and then I couldn't look up at the lecturer. So I'd have to do most of my work in the dark, or take classes where I could only do exams because I couldn't type papers or look at let alone look at my phone. So I had to tailor everything in a specific way to my new reality. And throughout this year, dealing with not only the symptoms, but dealing with the pressures from outside, I decided that I was going to hopefully make a difference. I was going to come out and tell everyone what had been happening and how I'd been dealing with it. And a lot of people around me knew. And when I would come out and just talk about how I was being treated, everything would go away, and I would be successful in helping the next guy. And that was kind of what everything was about. But when I did, I guess I found out that that's not how the traumatic brain injury field works, unfortunately. And everyone I tried to tell my story to, or on the higher scale, didn't want to hear it. And I guess I thought I was lonely before, but then I guess after finding out that when I did speak up, it wasn't going to be heard. So I had a lot of friends at the time who supported me, but I guess just running into the support systems that I thought would be there, they in turn didn't feel like they were. So I took a step back and from trying to find support in that area. And I continued on at Brown. I would do my work, and the way that I was going to go about this, and whether it's correct or not, or whether I am going to make the difference or the change that I want to, I ended up saying, okay, well, how did I end up here? And the way that I thought that I ended up there was this limiting mindset where I came back and I was going to play hockey, and no matter what, I had these injuries along the way, and I was going to show up the next day, and I was just going to power through, and I was the toughest guy. I thought I was the toughest guy in the world. It looked like a puppy dog. I'm not a tough guy. I thought I was going to be the toughest guy in the world, and I thought that's what tough was. And then I never really realized that the toughest thing that I could have done was say, hey, maybe I can do something else. Maybe this isn't healthy for me anymore. Maybe I can look to the guy beside me and say, like, will you support me if I looked outside of the ice? And I never did that. And then so when I came to Brown, and over the last few years, I've actively tried my best to join different clubs, be part of different aspects of the community. I am an economics major. I got an internship my sophomore year in New York City at a bank, and I had to hold an ice bag on my eyes, rotating from eye to eye throughout the whole day because I couldn't look at computer screens without ice. I was released from that job. But I was really trying my best just to say, hey, I can do something else. I can be someone else. And luckily enough, that does have a happy story. I will continue on so this was 3 years later of kind of like looking for answers and dealing with people. I did have supportive staff along the way when I went into the medical field. I was a very unclear case of what would be the answer for me. I dealt with people like Dr. Cruz who were very supportive, but I kept looking for the answer. And along the way, I was still actively trying to show that I could be more. And I ended up getting a job, my dream job, or what I thought would be at bank at Goldman Sachs. And right after that, I dropped out of school because I said, hey, this was my journey to show other people that I could get a great job, or I could live in a different zip code or whatnot. And then I realized that I couldn't look at a computer screen or my phone for 5 seconds, so that wasn't going to actually happen. So I dropped out of school, and I took that year seeing a doctor in Florida where I was dealt with from my symptoms from a different angle. And I've recently gone back and forth about the treatment there, where I worked with her just because she gave me a new diet. I was ostracized in a way of not having to deal with the kind of being in classes or doing this or the stresses of my life. I got to start training again, do different things. She put me back in sports. She put me back, when I say sports, she put me back running. She put me back doing a number of different things, a number of exercises, not just vestibular, like kind of the eye training, but a number of, for lack of a better term, like trying to like reorientate my brain with the world. And slowly, while working with her, I went from being able to watch a YouTube clip for 1 minute to 2 minutes to 5 minutes, and then I was watching TV shows with my mom, and it was one of the happiest days of our life. And I said, Mom, did you ever think that one of the best days ever, or one of the most things you're gonna be excited for me would be like, we're watching The Office together? So I said, all those times you told me to stop watching TV, you shouldn't. So I had, over the last year, I've had a major return back. And I guess the biggest things that I'm looking to deal with moving forward is just how this injury is received. And I've talked with a number of students that are trying to exit their sport or trying to find support. And I guess the biggest thing is, as long as this awareness can come forward, I felt very isolated, and I felt like because people think that they've dealt with concussions or they've had a headache or they've had this, I feel like it's it affects people in very different ways. And because of that, everyone doesn't really know everyone thinks that they've dealt with it or they should deal with it this way, or it's a cookie cutter thing. So I'm hoping moving forward that the support can, first of all, the awareness can come, and then with the awareness, the support can come for people like me who present with very interesting symptoms and spend 3.5 years trying to get back to watching The Office. Other than that, happy to answer any questions. I think she's giving him the mic.
And that was brilliant talk, Braedan. I just wanted to kind of throw a story to you, because it's kind of a similar story to you, but a very different way of going about it. There was an athlete back home, quite up and coming, strong athletic identity, one of kind of the athletes people were looking out for. Oh, watch him in a few years, he's going to be one of the big ones. And then all of a sudden he had to retire because he had too many concussions. He'd never really managed them properly or didn't receive any proper management. And so I reached out to him. I was like, oh, maybe I can help or something. Maybe, I've been in that situation where you have to try readjust your life because your athletic identity is over and you have to try to do something else. And no word of a lie, when I reached out to him, I was coming out of purely trying to help and trying to understand what management he got from his perspective. And he said, how much money are you willing to give me for that information? As in, he was looking for it as a business opportunity for himself. So just to put him on one side and then put you on the other side, where you're actively going around as a TBI awareness advocate, I'd say just another round of applause. I think that was a fantastic talk, and I really appreciate what you're doing. And I think all of us doing like research or whatever, it really stems from people like yourself. I think I just thought it was a brilliant talk, and yeah, pretty much.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We have Dr. Small at the front as well. Okay.
Braedan, you just kind of glossed over it, but you mentioned about your legs, and I don't think anyone caught that. Can you tell everyone your mindset about that when you were coming here, and about a more definitive injury that someone would recognize as a reason not to play? Because you went into great detail with me with that.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and I think I for whatever reason, and I don't know if this is good or bad, so I'm sorry if it was, I took out, just in this setting, I think I took out a lot of the drama, but a lot of this, this was very hard hitting for me, and something like my legs. There was a number of scenarios coming into school where, when I say that, I jumped off I jumped off a school near my house trying to break my legs, which is harder than you would think, to break your legs. And I was doing so because you have no idea how much easier it would have been for me to show up with broken legs and come to the rink and not been harassed in front of my teammates. When are you going to play? Are you like, when are you going to suit up? When are you going to play hockey again? I would have, if I could have grabbed someone and gone to sleep and they just broke my legs, or just one, maybe not both, I would have 2,000% have taken that. And I know that's a vivid photo, but if that was my decision, that was absolutely what I wanted coming in freshman year, because I knew that I was going to have to, not only, people were going to look at me and say that you looked fine, and I was still very with it as you are with the concussion in a number of scenarios. But so I knew that I was going to have to basically overcome this thought process that people had of, or maybe you just don't want to be here, or you're just not. So I was going to have to overcome that, and I think that translated in a lot of settings. And I hopefully moving forward, as this awareness does come, even stuff like professors, I never felt like they should have to. They should have to tailor everything to me. I know there's a lot of things going on, but there's a lot of times when I had to come in and really drop my heart on the table to a professor just to get it on a midterm. And in both parties, I would just sit there why am I doing this, or why do I have to? So it was a lot of the advocation for myself was kind of like the hardest part and most tiring part over and over again. I really wish it was just like I had something where everybody, like a disease that everybody was like, oh, he has that, that is horrible. Whereas now I still have residual effects where I still wake up with concussion syndromes and post-concussion syndrome every day. It's gotten a lot better, but for 3.5 years, it was burning pain from the moment I woke up, and my roommates wouldn't even know. So, yeah.
Hi, Braedan. I'm a neurologist, and I want to second everyone's comments about your courage and your successes, and congratulations on that, and thanks for the talk. I don't want to get into private issues of your medical care, but I presume you had a lot of test results that were negative, neurologic test results. Is that right? And the reason I want to follow up on the question about your legs. I mean, suppose there were a test result that said, you know, this test says you have TBI, like an MRI scan or a blood test or some other kind of test that you have an MRI or you have a TBI. Would that have changed the attitudes of the people around you, you think, or not?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think like the biggest thing for me was like, I was realistic where like, I think it's even harder because I knew that I had a concussion in the past that it only lasted a couple weeks or so. And I knew that that was some people's like frame of reference. So I was sympathetic on the other side to like, I was not like, oh, like you guys don't understand how much pain I'm in. Like I took other people's mind frames where I was like, a year ago, I would have been like, like, yeah. I mean, so it was really hard because I would have done anything for somehow someone to be able to see what the world looked like for me. A number of days that I've described, it just, because I had this like vertigo, like off balance kind of shifting symptom, it felt like I was floating around campus, and then I would have to just act like everything was fine. Because I didn't feel like if I was then always like going on about that or trying to advocate to my friends or anything like that, it just gets tiring. And I know that that's just the reality, because I can't just be like, oh, I have this and people understand that. The other option is to continuously tell people, and then we know how that goes. So I kind of just took it all in and floated around.
So we're not going to get that test for you, but we'll get it. We'll work our asses off to get that test for other people in the future.
Yeah, no, that'd be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was, superb talk, and I thank you for sharing. I know that's not an easy thing to do. I think it's important. The more you talk, the more people will benefit, and the more people will understand what the situation is and how it's treated in society. I wish you'd known about the preferred method, though, of getting out of this stuff. I think it's President Trump suggests bone spurs, okay, as a method. So just it's a little less traumatic and easier to prove. That gets you out of other things like Vietnam too. So hockey's nothing. And the additional comment just is that you certainly had an advantage coming here, because your scholarship, or if you got scholarship money or whatever, was not dependent on playing, which is not the situation at most places. In other words, at most places, you don't play, you're gone. And thank you very much for coming. See you later. Same thing's true in many places if you get injured, even while playing. That's changed somewhat, but it used to be one-year deals. People don't understand that if you get injured playing a sport, not only is there no long-term compensation plan for you, or medical plan or coverage, but you can lose your scholarship. So, I mean, that's just some other things to consider from a policy perspective as we look at people that we call, quote, student athletes, who I call student workers, at places where they're actually working for their tuition.
I can agree with that. I mean, I know that, I don't have much rebuttal against it, other than I knew that I didn't receive financial aid, and I guess it's not really to do with your point, but having to pay X amount, come down here in the States, and then not be part of my sport, and then being kind of harassed in the way I was, I don't know. I guess I didn't feel extremely lucky but I'm not answering it. I don't know. I guess I'm just detesting that I know my parents. I know my parents had to pay a lot of money in.
Most of the people who come, I think, get money. Some. At least half of the school.
Yeah.
So there's no scholarships for athletes at Brown University or any Ivy League institution. All the athletes that come to Brown, either they get the same financial aid as any other student, or they pay their own way, as Braedan says.
Right, that was my point. It's not true at Ohio State.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions in the audience?
She
Okay.
was early on.
Oh, yeah.
She's been scared.
Tired of me asking questions, though. I really wanted to thank you for talking about the bullying. And one of the guys in my slide deck who went to another Ivy League was of going in as a freshman as sort of the golden boy coming in for playing football, and he concussed the first week at his Ivy League school. And he was bullied terribly by the team. And once the coach invited him to come watch the tapes, and he only made it through the first week of practice, and the coach invited him in. And as he came in the locker, the team grabbed him, stripped off the team uniform, and told him, get out of here, you're not going to watch the video with us, in a very rude way. And he literally felt like that team kind of hunted him down. And I've heard from the girls' side more isolation, like that they were kind of excluded. But I've heard some pretty bad stories about teammates going after other teammates, and I think that's real, and that's I don't think a lot of people go public with that, so I really appreciate that. And did you get to a point with the team that after a while you did connect with them, or did you find other, how did you resolve that with those team members?
So sorry, yeah. And I think that's very important. I think these are you come in, these are the kind of people you know, these are the kind of people you've been around your whole life. So you're really looking for them as a support network, and that's why I've talked to a lot of teams about this is how you deal with a person, this is how you, and I think I might have described that a little bit wrong. I will preface it with the people I played hockey with, the actual teammates I had here at Brown University are the best people I've ever met in my entire life, and they were always unbelievable to me. So it was mostly just the coaching in that scenario, and not from the head coach. He was also, but it was just this one specific vertical that was kind of going around to the guys saying a number of different things. But the actual kids themselves, which would have been the hardest thing beyond the other stuff, if the guys turned on me, which I know I've heard a lot of stories from talking to other people. You just get ostracized, or a lot of people have anxiety, or the way that they're dealing with it is not their fault, and they're putting that back on the guys in a kind of way, and the kids don't understand that, and they're just like, okay, whatever, you're not part of the team, you're not even playing, we don't care, and kind of push someone off. But in my experience, just the guys that I had here, and I think this is, I hope, overlyingly true. I think the student body here at Brown is incredible, and that's just so they were very good to me. So I would never complain about my specific scenario, but I've heard that scenario over and over again. I think that would have been unbelievably hard. I can't think about dealing with that as well.
And I think it's just a misconception. I think you're talking about the invisible injury, and when I was diagnosed with cancer, it was invisible initially too, but there was a social construct around when someone has cancer, you're really nice to them. So I believe that over time we can educate people about brain injury. I think we're moving forward with mental illness. I think we're moving forward as a society, but I'd really like that compassion to extend to the invisible injuries.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. I think the biggest border there, the biggest breakdown because I thought about that a lot, and I was like, why isn't this happening? This has been going on for a long time. And I think the biggest border there is the differing in the injury, whereas because I had other concussions that weren't that bad, and then I had this concussion, you can't see the difference. I think that's the biggest problem. Is me 3 years ago, I would have said, yeah, I've had concussions too. Whereas me today being like, yeah, I've had concussions too, and I deal with it every single day. And I would think I would have had the same viewpoint, which is unfair. And I think that's the biggest problem in my view is there's differing ranges, and people experience things differently. So if there's any way to kind of, like you say, kind of get that more, get that out there, that some of those post-concussion syndrome is really haunting people in a number of different ways.
Well, I think people that hear your talk are going to forever remember it, so when they cross it in other areas in their life, will think of your experience. So I think the advocacy you're doing is really incredibly important.
thank you very much.
Braedan, great talk. Braedan gave this talk, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. We did it the first time for the Rhode Island Interscholastic League in front of about 250 players and coaches for a winter meeting, and you could hear a pin drop. I think he probably had about 10 or 15 players and coaches come up to him at the end of the meeting, and you know, it was obviously he has a powerful story to tell and a journey. Those of us that go to a lot of meetings and these kind of conferences, I think for the planners, if you're going to do this again, think about having some action items. I think there are a lot of action items we could take out of this today, and there are a number of us in the room. And Kathleen Bachynski, I think your public health perspective is really important. Part of Braedan's journey, which I do my clinical research in injury prevention and policy change. There's a big one here with the NCAA, particularly with ice hockey. I think the norm now is that players have to go and play junior hockey for 2 to 3 years, where they have a number of cumulative exposures before they can even step foot on campus, and then a lot of them enter as 20-year-old freshmen. And I think it's unnecessary. The level of play has increased, and we've seen that in youth sports too, but the NCAA is guilty on a number of levels. We've certainly seen with recruiting patterns, you know, up until recently, 8th and 9th graders are being recruited in women's lacrosse and soccer, and it still happens in football with 8th and 9th grade quarterbacks being plucked out of states. What that's doing, I'm a pediatrician, so you're increasing the number of exposures to the middle school age kids with all of these showcases and events, and the pressure to be seen by college coaches and showing up with repetitive injuries. And you go to these tournaments over 5, 6 games in a weekend, and it's a real public health issue. And I think the NCAA, I've actually been invited to give a commentary on this very topic, and I think, you know, maybe a number of us can also email about this and do it collectively for a sports medicine journal, because I think it's real, and I'm ready to take it on. I think people like Braedan have shown me that we just can't sit back and be bystanders to this. You know, we really need to take action on these things, and there's a voice, and the voice needs to be heard.
Thank you. Any more questions outside of them? Yeah. Okay. Oh, we'll come back.
Hi, my name is Lena. Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned earlier that when you were 14, you played through a concussion because you wanted to try out for was it the national?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's called Team Canada East. It was one of our national teams for hockey. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering, thinking of your 14-year-old self at that time, was there anyone who could have convinced you not to play and not to, because it sounds like it was an incredibly big opportunity. Do you think that if your parents or if coaches or some other kind of mentor had spoken to you, they could have convinced you not to play?
I think at the time, and I'm hoping things have changed, it wasn't talked about enough that I very much don't think someone could have convinced me to miss kind of a regular game. I don't know, or in a playoff game that wasn't really that important. I felt back then it wasn't being communicated enough. I didn't see that there was these major drawbacks. It was you just get a hit, you have a you have a headache, or you have a kind of a little bit of a setback. So I think had someone or there just been this conversation about real world issues going on, or just some big cases to point to, and there are, for whatever reason, I still feel like they don't get out enough, because I'm close to the hockey team or a number of guys, and I don't think these real world scenarios like myself, where I'm 4.5 years later and I'm still have symptoms from the minute I wake up to the minute I go to bed. Had I known that, I just don't feel like anyone ever spoke to me about that. And I don't think if one person just sat me down and said that, I would be like, okay, yeah, that's just one person. But I think there's a lot more going on. I've helped a number of people leave sport because of symptoms they're experiencing. So I think if this was built and people were kind of hearing that this is a real world possibility, then absolutely. But I don't think at the time that it was talked about enough then that one person could have said, I think that I needed to hear it, or this needed to be raised to a level where it was, and it felt something scary. So.
Hi, my name is Brendan. I'm a current student. And I'm curious what sorts of accommodations could have been put forth for you in order to make choosing classes sort of easier for you. You know, you talked a lot about having to pick and choose things that you could do with only tests or without having to go to a lecture and staring at a screen for 90 minutes. And I'm curious what, one, especially other students, but two, Brown as an institution, and like, think fantasy realm, not just, you know, here's one realistic step. Like, what could be done to make that easier for you?
So for me, and I kind of rehashed this with Rachel yesterday, because I was looking at it and I was like, I tried to be a little more realistic and say like, well, what could have really helped me and what could have made a major difference? And I think the biggest thing was the fragmentation of, I showed up and a number of different people were like, oh, we could support you, or like this, or there's accommodations, or there's this, or like you can talk to this dean if you need this. And then I would go to this professor, the biggest thing that I wish looking back on it, because I felt like I spent a lot of energy and it was the hardest thing for me. Maybe it was a good skill to learn for advocation, but like I'd have to go to professors and like put my heart on their desk and then not take their class again, a class with them, because I felt like I asked too much out of them. Like, I gotta miss this material, I'm in a lot of pain, I need to do, or can I have this, or like, so if I just had someone somehow that was fully like, I just kept up with, I was like, going to see this doctor, they knew everything, like I'm going to see this person, or I'm talking, this is my symptom, this is the, sit down with me, how are you feeling, this is like, and then I just reached to them and they were willing to go to this professor, I could link them in a CC and they could deal with the professor and I could just stay out of it, and they knew fully what was going on and really had my back in a way. And I guess I sometimes, I don't know, also maybe a little bit of my fault of not really pushing for that, but I felt like if I could have had like a pocket of just, I go to this person, they know everything about me, they know how much I'm going through, and then they're the number one, they just go and do the advocation for me. I think that would also mitigate it, because I know I hear a lot about people saying, well, like, oh, this kid said he had a concussion, or this kid said he had a concussion, he's fine, or like this or that. I think if someone sat down in a number of cases where you have post-concussion syndrome and you listen to the person talk about the symptoms they have, or if you would have listened to me talk about like what my day-to-day was like for 5 minutes, you'd be like, okay, like, yeah, like that sounds horrible. I want to help, and I would be very willing to talk to that professor, and I'm not, and sorry, people did sit down with me, but just this, then follow through with the professors, and that I'm not just kind of like bringing a story to the table, that I fully am going through something, that I'm trying my best. I would love to show up to that class and just be like everybody else, but that just wasn't the scenario.
That 14-year-old self, would it have made a difference if you had seen if you had seen professional hockey players take themselves out for concussion? Like, were you basing yourself off the kids you knew, or were you basing yourself off the professional sports heroes you had?
Yeah, so probably a mix of both, but probably professionals. I think it's come out a little bit with like the movie Concussion and stuff like that, but I still feel like it's not there for whatever reason. So if there was more of like more talk about it, or more just real world scenarios, like even like I don't know, it seems weird to me. There's a number of scenarios where people have died, and I've like read about people that have, and I knew someone growing up that died from second impact, and I don't know. That's just, there's some force that's like holding that at bay. And when you talk about, you talked earlier about like the kind of joking about like concussions or the TBI brain, like unfortunately, like because that just feels like the way it is, I joke about it with my friends, and and just to like downplay, just so I don't feel like it, even though I absolutely should not, but like in like to feel like I'm part of like, and not putting that on like my hockey friends or anything like that. I'm part of that culture. Like a lot of the time I'm advocating until telling them, but then I still feel like that like overlying joke, and I guess that's part of, I made jokes about things I probably shouldn't have today, but I still feel like that's part of the problem. Sorry, I don't know if I completely answered that.